Hey guys, today we're talking about Philip, who is mentioned fifth in the listings of the disciples in those few Gospels that we've already mentioned throughout all of our talks. And I just want to introduce him to you before we unpack his character a little bit more. He's not as significant as those first four. We've covered now probably the closest disciples to Jesus, and now we're moving more down that list to guys that weren't standing out as much as part of Jesus's closest disciples. But there's something still significant in him being named fifth. That means as part of that second group, he would have stood out as someone who was more prominent in leading that group. All right, so another thing we want to clarify about Philip here, I think a lot of us know about the story about Philip the evangelist. So this is not Philip the evangelist, who we see later in the Gospels as the Philip who leads the Ethiopian eunuch to Jesus Christ. This is not that same Philip, and it's quite important for us to recognize that because these are completely different characters. So guys, it's very likely that many of Jesus' disciples were fishermen. We know that the first four that we've already mentioned were fishermen, along many others. We see this in later texts within the scriptures, within the Gospels. But now focusing on Philip, we also know that Philip was one of the disciples that Jesus had found in Bethsaida. And therefore we know that he probably would have had some kind of association with the sons of Zebedee, with John and James, and even so with Peter and Andrew. And so we get a better idea of the context and where Jesus was getting a majority of his disciples, all being Jewish, and many of them being found in Bethsaida, close to Nazareth, where he came from. So Philip is then called to Jesus' ministry, not even a day after, basically a day after the main four that we're speaking of were called to follow Jesus. And we also know that there's an association there between Nathanael, also known as Bartholomew, and Philip. And we're going to dive a bit more into that relationship next week when we get to speaking about Nathanael. But as for now, we can recognize that this circle and this intimate relationship between Jesus and his disciples, they're a lot closer than we initially think. We initially think they're few and far between, but actually they had very similar livelihoods and experiences. So to add on, speaking about Philip and his life, we know that only John, as one of the gospel writers, actually mentions Philip. So what we see in John's gospel about Philip's character is that he is this process person. He's a person who's orientated around processes and organization and keeping things together. And so he's a facts and figures guy, trying to make sure that everybody is sorted for enough food and has a space to sleep at night. This is kind of who we're looking at when we speak about Philip. He's Captain Logistics, if you like. Okay? So there's a lot of positives in that, but also a lot of negatives, especially from a leadership perspective. Like we said, probably leaded that second group. He was the leader of that second group of four disciples. So what we see in John, in the gospel according to John, is that Philip is a guy who is by the book. He is practical minded, but this also means he's not forward thinking. He's not thinking about the bigger picture. He's sort of stuck in the moment to moment, making sure that every day everything is sought after. Okay? So this means he's narrowly focused. And so guys, can you see there's a bit of a problem in that? It means that often when Jesus is trying to get his disciples to see what they're doing all this for, what they as a group are aiming towards, he would often miss what Jesus was referring to, because he was stuck on the day in and day out and the logistics that needed to be sorted after day in and day out. So ultimately this means that we're actually looking at a person who is quite pessimistic. For those of you who don't know what that means, it means he has a very negative outlook on life. You know, if we were to make a modern day example, think about a meeting setting where you've got a Google Meet with your class, and there's always that one person who never ends up seeing the positive in the negative, and is always pointing out, but this, but that, what about this, what about that? And I'm not saying it's not good to ask these questions, but the point there is that he questions everything with a doubtful, negative attitude. And that's obviously not necessarily a desirable trait. And so he has a defeatist mentality. There's never an opportunity for things to get better. It is what it is kind of thing. But in reality, there's so much to look forward to, so much positivity, especially in this time with Jesus, seeing the Messiah, being a follower of the Messiah. And yet he was the guy who was always asking these negative questions. But this doesn't make Philip now the worst character, the worst disciple, okay? On the contrary, when he was called to follow Jesus, he, within an instant, knowing like all the other disciples of the prophecies and of the coming of Jesus, he in an instant knew that when Jesus said, "Follow me," and he recognized that he was the Messiah, there was no hesitation. There was an instant, "Yes, I will follow you." And so what's funny about this is, as we've just looked at Philip's character, this is quite contrary to who he says he is. And it's out of his character, because going from that defeatist negative mentality, there's one thing he knew for sure, which was that Jesus was there and Jesus was calling him to follow. And that's amazing, guys. And I think there's a lesson in that for us, is that no matter where we're at, no matter what we think, when we see Jesus and we focus on Jesus, we see that the answer lies in Jesus. No matter what perspective or mentality we have, what outlook we have on life. Because Jesus is always the answer. Jesus is always going to be there for us. And that was one thing we can already highlight in Philip. Despite who he is, he sees a light in Jesus. So I'm going to take us back to a story we looked at with the disciple of Jesus known as Andrew. And in this story, which is the feeding of the 5,000, we see Jesus first approach Philip when the large crowd arrives. So I'm going to read to you from John chapter 6 verse 5. And it reads, "Lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?'" So guys, what we can see from this is that it seems very much like Philip is the logistics guy, not just like we've explained in his character, but specifically the person responsible for the caretaking and well-being of the group of disciples. And he asked this question to Philip probably very much for that very reason, saying, "Okay, we've got now all these people here. How are we going to feed them, Philip? You're in charge of this. Can you look into how we're going to provide food for these people?" Now, I want you guys to keep in mind, at this point, Jesus has already performed so many miracles and already asserted himself as this Messiah who is capable of so many amazing things. And so what we can see in that is that this questioning to Philip is actually testing him. He's testing to see, "Philip, what is your faith? How strong is your faith?" And so we know in Philip following Jesus that yes, he's a man of faith and he has faith in the Messiah. But how much faith does he actually have in him as God? How much faith does he have in his ability to do miraculous things, to do supernatural things? And so in this instance, we see that his faith, even though it's there, is actually very weak. He does not have strong faith. And so when we go later to John 6 verse 7, we see that Philip is ultimately coming to a point where he says, we don't have the means to feed all these people. It's very likely that Philip would have sat and already started counting the heads of the people. They're calculating in what way, how much money do they need to get what food to provide for all these people. And that's how his mind is. It's so earthly based. It's so fixated on the physical and on what man can provide. And then there's not an element of him that is able to focus on the supernatural aspect of Jesus. And so what's the point here, guys? The point here is that there's such a need for us to have faith. Philip lacked in faith, and Jesus knew this. And so him questioning Philip was not just a lesson to the rest of the disciples, but a lesson for Philip as well. For him to recognize that Jesus is able to do anything because he is God. And so I want to refer you guys to the Matthew 17 verse 20 passage. And this is the passage which speaks about having faith like a mustard seed. Having faith to move mountains. And that's the kind of faith that we need to have. And so now I want to turn over this thinking to you. I want to ask you guys, how many of us are like Philip? How many of us are unable to trust in God and trust that He's got the situations we're in, the difficult aspects of our lives, that He's got that in His hands? And all it takes is for us to turn to Him and say, Father, there's only so much I can do. What can you do? Because you can do amazing things. What can you do in this situation? Because I think we all have moments where we see things in our lives and we just believe they're impossible to overcome. They're impossible to deal with until we bring Jesus into those situations. So ultimately, guys, when things get tough, are you able to look deeper and go further with Christ and say, you know what? I'm not going to lean on my own understanding, on my own strength, but I'm solely going to go to God with this. Are we able to do that? Do we make an effort to do that? So Philip isn't all bad. We've recognized his characteristics and how they carry through even into the ministry that he serves with Jesus in. But I want to point us to another story. Again, like I said in the beginning, we're looking at the book of John, and it's the only place we can find scriptures on Philip. But when we fast forward to John 12, again we have Philip being over-analytical about something, in a position where he's not eager to be held responsible for making an assertive decision. You know, if something's not black and white enough for him to make the decision, then he's rather going to be reserved about it, remove himself from the situation as best as possible. And so what happens in John chapter 12 is there's a number of Greeks coming and looking for Jesus. They're interested in who Christ is. And the thought that they would come to Philip is probably because they knew he was the logistics guy, the guy keeping the camp together. If anybody knew where Jesus was, it would be Philip. And so these Greeks come to Philip and they ask him, where is Jesus? We want to meet Jesus. We want to know who he is. And so instantly we get Philip's response being, okay, I can help you out. And he just goes straight to Andrew and he says, here we go, Andrew's going to help you out. Okay, go for it. So what we can see there is Philip is in two minds about whether he should take these people to Jesus or not. There are a number of scriptures where we see how Jesus has spoken to the disciples in such a way to say we go to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. And if this is the understanding that Philip would have had, and he sees, okay, these might not be Jews, if they're Greek, they lean more towards maybe being a Gentile. But there we see this hesitant nature, this nature that, you know, he doesn't want to make assertive decisions, very reserved in his acting. When in actual fact, we know that Jesus desired everybody to come to him. And we know later in the story that Jesus does encounter these people and he does share the truth with them. And it's a positive thing. It's a good thing. It's not something Jesus denied in any way. So it would have been fine if Philip did it, but Philip was unable to make that decision because of this reserved nature. So guys, what is this all leading to? What can we understand about Philip in this? We've seen a lot of negative in Philip because of being more held back and indecisive and only really concerned about the day-to-day practical aspects of the ministry that he served with Jesus in. And so what I first want to point out is that not everyone is called to make big decisions. Not all of us are called to be leaders, and that's okay. But ultimately what stands out with Philip is that his heart is in the right place, even though he doesn't have the confidence and the decisiveness to make important decisions when the time comes. Because he still has a heart for the Lord, he's still able to point people in the right direction. Give people that little bit of guidance that they need in order to get to Jesus. And this is okay. He's still able to lead people in the right direction. And in this story, going back to the story, he leads people to Andrew. Okay? So when I look at us, guys, how can we learn from this? For you and me, many of us are lucky to know others who are gifted in leadership and evangelism and in sharing the good news with those outside the church walls. I'm not saying that all of us are unable. I think everybody's got the capacity and potential to share faith with people that are close to them. But what about those people who can share faith with anybody? And what if some random came up to you and said they wanted to know more about Jesus? Maybe you're like Philip and you don't necessarily know what to say or what the right thing to say would be. And that's what I'm getting to, guys. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with this not being your gifting. There's nothing wrong with not having a gifting in leadership and in evangelism. So what ultimately matters is that we all have a heart for people to know Jesus. Have a heart and a desire that people knowing Jesus and them being led to Christ is life-changing for them. And desiring that for every single human being. I think all of us need to have that. And if a lot of us are like Phillip, that's okay. But then let's do what Phillip does and lead these people in the right direction. Lead them to someone that they can have a conversation with and develop a relationship with and get to a point of being able to know Jesus. At the end of the day, Jesus has gifted us all in different ways. And some of us are more reserved, like Phillip. Some of us don't like being put in a situation where we have to be very instinctive and, what's the word I'm looking for? Just encouraging and optimistic and proactive in what we do. Not all of us are like that. And that's okay. But if we're not, let's make sure that the heart that we have and the love that we have for Jesus is still able to pour out onto others. And whether it's coming indirectly or directly from us, doesn't matter. And so if leading someone who comes and asks you as a Christian about Jesus and you're not quite sure what to say, just say, hey, come with me to church. Let's talk about this. Let's unpack it with a pastor. Let's go have a meeting with someone that you know has a gifting in this. And that's all you need to do. At the end of the day, guys, Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And serving Christ in the ministry is not about having this huge weight and responsibility on our shoulders, but it's about taking the gifting God has given us and using it to the full capacity. When we look at Philip, we see a person who loves the Lord. And even though he's not the best at leading people to him, his love for him is enough that he'll do whatever it takes that they get to that space where there are those who will lead them to the Lord. So thanks again for your time. Have a fantastic evening, afternoon, morning, whatever time of day, whatever time of night, whatever time it is for you. Enjoy it. And I will see you all next week. Thank you, guys.